joining us right now on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. You can follow him on Twitter at Bax Football Guru. Russell Baxter, NFL historian, always has great insights, and he was the perfect person I thought of with the Hall of Fame inductions coming in to give everybody some historical context on the kind of class that we got going into Canton tonight. And he joins us now on 97.3 ESPN. Russell, how you doing this weekend?
I'm good, Josh. How are you? I am. We're about 6 hours away, I think, from the enshrinement ceremonies. I'll be making my way down there in a few hours, and I've been coming out here pretty regularly since 1989. That first year I was in for nostalgic buffs. Willie Wood, Terry Bradshaw, Mel Blount, and Art Shell. Quite the class.
Yeah.
And in those days, the ceremony was held on the steps about 11 o'clock in the morning. And then the game was played about 3 hours later, 2:30 on ABC. That first year I went out, the Bills played the Redskins. And now, of course, it's morphed into something so amazing. I was speaking with Joe Horgan last night, the curator, and really one of the brainchilds of the Hall of Fame progressing as it has for like the last 30 years, the game being moved to prime time, the stadium now holding the induction ceremonies, mainly because Jim Kelly brought about 3,000 of his closest friends, and that's not an exaggeration, when he was inducted in 2002. And it went over so big that the steps became the steps, and now the stadium holds the event.
Let's talk about this class tonight, because to me, and you just mentioned it, you've seen a lot of these classes go in and see how this has evolved over the years. To me, this is an historic class because, look, nothing against Kurt Warner or Kenny Easley, but, they're not among some of the best, like the top five to play their position. And you could argue with the two receivers going in, with the two linebackers going in, with Dawkins going in, and a guy in Jerry Kramer who set the precedent for how great guards should play in the NFL. These are some of the top five players to play at their position in league history.
Oh, there's no question about it. A couple of years ago when I was with Bleacher Report, I did a piece on ranking the Hall of Fame classes, okay? So, I used to kid with them. I said, how do you put a worst Hall of Fame class? There's no...
Right.
There's no such thing. I mean, it's crazy. But I will say this, Josh. Let's not forget it wasn't all that long ago, earlier this decade, that the all-time leading rusher and the all-time leading receiver went in the same year. I think people forget that Emmitt Smith and Jerry Rice were both in the same class. So I also remember a class which I believe included Walter Payton, Chuck Noll, Bill Walsh. I mean, I might be speaking out of turn here because I don't have, the 50-something classes memorized. I believe this will be number 55. 1963 was the first class, which was 17 charter members, and now, it kind of goes to form and so on. Listen, as far as the modern day era, a prolific middle linebacker. And by the way, for people who think the defense gets shortchanged in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, you weren't paying attention. There's three linebackers in this class.
Right.
Two middle linebackers, Ray Lewis and Brian Urlacher. Robert Brazil, who I remember very, very well with those Houston Oilers teams. I was talking with Chris Mortensen last night during the dinner, and those Oiler teams in the late 70s, you want to talk about, timing is everything. Can you imagine what they might have accomplished if the Pittsburgh Steelers weren't around the same decade? It was like those great Minnesota Vikings teams, Josh. You think about all their Hall of Famers as well. Fran Tarkenton, Carl Eller, Alan Page, Mick Tingelhoff went in a couple of years ago. Great Bud Grant, the head coach. Great teams. But all they did was play in an era where they ran into the team that won more games than any team in AFL history, the Kansas City Chiefs. They got the Miami Dolphins a year after they were perfect. They were the first victim of the Steelers dynasty. And they got a very irritated Oakland Raiders team that couldn't get past Miami and Pittsburgh. So, just like the Bills of the 90s who are, have gotten their due with Bruce Smith and Andre Reed and Thurman Thomas and Jim Kelly and Mark Levy and so on. There's so many great players and so many great teams, and it's sometimes they do get overlooked, which is why I talk about Robert Brazil and, of course, Jerry Kramer, who you ever mentioned. who, I mean, being at the dinner last night, it was just so amazing. I got a chance to meet Jerry Kramer very, very briefly. But as he's making the walk, I believe with his daughter down the row of Hall of Famers, and then I think it was Randy Moss and Brian Dawkins who helped him up to the stage. I mean, how can you not be choked up by that? A man who's waited 50 years, and listen, has been very outspoken about the wait as well. But as he kidded last night, everything is wonderful, everything is great, nothing's wrong, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, it's a year where I bring that up because for obvious reasons, one of the 8 members is not here this weekend.
Right. Sticking with Kramer, I want to focus on him for a moment because, you know, a lot of the people who neglect history, which is a shame on them, to me, Kramer set the standard for how a guard should play. I mean, he was the original top-end pulling guard of his era. To me, he set the precedent for how great guards should play in the decades to come. And to me, without him, you could argue there may never have been a Packers dynasty because, remember, it was him that Bart Starr snuck behind. If it wasn't for him, there's a whole generation of guards that style of play that may have never come into the NFL.
Yeah, and that's a great point because there have obviously been guards, offensive guards that have come into the league and gone on to the Pro Football Hall of Fame after him. But sometimes the guy who's the most recognized, and it happens so often that he kind of gets pushed in the backwash. And I'm not saying that's fair. I think that's just what happened with Jerry Kramer. Almost somewhat overlooked because of the greatness of the Packers of the 60s. Of course, won 5 titles during that decade, and Green Bay's still the only team in NFL history to win 3 straight titles. People don't realize it's not just no team's won 3 straight Super Bowls. No team has won 3 straight NFL titles other than the Packers. It's very, very hard to repeat and so on. But, I mean, you look at – I saw John Hanna last night, who a lot of people regard as maybe the greatest guard to ever play. Obviously, that's all subjective. You know, Tom Mack was there last night. You know, obviously Randall McDaniel's part of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Jim Parker from the Colts, who played guard and tackle. Will Shields, my goodness. I mean, he started like 223 games. But, yeah, Jerry Kramer kind of got kind of pushed in the background, and it became this waiting game. I said this to a couple people at the table last night. To me, it would have only been fitting. And watching Mr. Kramer, you know, make his way down the row of Hall of Famers, and at times last night he was in a chair, you know, because of obviously his mobility and so on. Think of the irony, and this is for old-time football fans who will remember this. The last game that Vince Lombardi coached for the Green Bay Packers, he was carried off the field on the shoulders of the Packer players, and most prominently was Jerry Kramer.
Yep.
Somehow I was kind of envisioning last night the Pro Football Hall of Famers who were there carrying Jerry Kramer on their shoulders up to that stage.
Talking to Russell Baxter right now on the Boardwalk Honda hotline on 97.3 ESPN. Of course, the Hall of Fame inductions are tonight. You can watch the coverage on ESPN and NFL Network. Russell, one of my favorite players of all time, and, you know, I'm going to try to be objective with this, but I'm very excited to see Brian Dawkins go in tonight. Dawkins is the only player in NFL history to have at least 25 sacks, 25 interceptions, and 25 forced fumbles for a career. The guy was incredible as a safety, but one of the most interesting things about him that I think is overlooked is that the Eagles actually built their defense around him. And it's very rare to see a defense work and built through and around a safety.
Yeah, you're starting to see the safety position get a little more recognition in terms of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. We've seen, you know, a couple go in. I mean, recently, you know, Kenny Easley, who was, you know, another guy who waited a long time. Mm-hmm. And then over the next couple of years, Josh, you know, I'm one of those people, I don't like to say first ballot Hall of Famer because you never know what's on the minds of the voters, okay? I think every year we feel like someone gets snubbed. Every year someone gets overlooked, et cetera, et cetera. But within the next couple of years, I think it's pretty safe to say that Ed Reed is going to be here and Troy Polamalu is going to be here.
Yep.
And I think that just kind of further emphasizes the safety position. Brian Dawkins was the ultimate playmaker and the ultimate tone setter. And, you know, when you think of Hall of Fame, I think that plays a very, very big part into what people are looking at in terms of the voters. I can't speak to the voters because I'm not one. But, you know, I think that's where the hang-up came up with Terrell Owens. And yet when you see guys like Ray Lewis and Brian Urlacher and Brian Dawkins, just mentioning a couple of those guys, you think of leadership. You think of the guy who stepped to the forefront. You think of the guy who made the big play when they had to make the big play. Okay? Regardless of their own individual numbers, it was all about the team. I mean, you think about Ray Lewis and what he brought, other than, by the way, incredible dance skills when it came to and so on. I was reminding someone last night, think about the 2000 Ravens for a second, okay? The 2000 Ravens won the Super Bowl as a wild card, which means they played 20 football games that year,
right,
including the regular season and the postseason. Josh, in those 20 games, they gave up a total of 188 points.
It's incredible.
Now, I want you to go back and look just the last few years in this league of who gave up the fewest points in the league and tell me where that number stands. 230, 240, which is still 15 points a game, don't get me wrong. 188 in 20 games. I think that's a number you're going to hear pretty often tonight.
And that's the thing you mentioned about, defense does get recognition. And, we talked about Dawkins. Lewis was a linebacker. Urlacher was a linebacker. And sometimes, when we're talking about the defensive side of the ball, we sometimes get hung up on stats. But it's also the intangibles, right? It's the fact that these guys are also leaders on the football field. Dawkins, Urlacher, Lewis, these are guys who, these were leaders of men, and guys followed them. And they were the reason why a lot of those defenses were elevated, because without them, you could argue those defenses would have never been as good as they were.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question about it. And listen, middle linebacker is one of those positions. It's the glamour, but it's not to take anything away from the defensive linemen, the safeties, the cornerbacks, and all that. But when you think about the glamour position in defense in the National Football League in its history, it's middle linebacker or inside linebacker, depending what your scheme is that you're playing it. So, think about the names: Dick Butkus, Ray Nitschke, Jack Lambert, Mike Singletary, Bill George, who think of the legacy with the Bears and middle linebackers alone. They have four now in.
Right.
Bill George, Dick Butkus, Mike Singletary, and Brian Urlacher. Okay? So you think of Sam Huff, Willie Lanier. These are the guys who, a lot of times in those old days, they called the defensive signals. They rallied around the troops. My goodness, for Steelers fans out there, and I'm sure there are a lot of them in your area and so on, you think about what Jack Lambert brought to the Pittsburgh Steelers defense. Jack Lambert wasn't afraid to yell at Mean Joe Green to tell him to get his act together when they were in the huddle. I think it was Donnie Shell who once said that during the Super Bowl against the Rams, Super Bowl 14, Donnie Shell said after the game that Jack Lambert yelled at everybody in the huddle so loud that Donnie Shell got scared. Donnie Shell is one of the most physical players to ever play. He's got about 50-something career interceptions. A lot of people think he should be in the Hall of Fame, and he got scared. So you think about Ray Lewis, and you think about Brian Urlacher, and you think about another linebacker, like we mentioned, Robert Brazil. All they did was call him Dr. Doom. Enough said.
When you look at Lewis and you look at Urlacher, the thing that stands out to me is while Lewis was insanely physically gifted as an athlete and as a competitor and hard worker, I think people forget about Urlacher as a cerebral player. There were times I would watch him and it felt like he knew the play before anybody else did, and he was already on the ball carrier or on the quarterback or on the ball in his hands on an interception before anybody else knew what was going on his own defense.
Well, Urlacher, I think people also forget his versatility when it came to the game. You remember, he played not only linebacker at New Mexico, he was safety as well. Okay? I believe he also did toil a little on kickoff returns as well. So this guy was a real well-versed football player when it came to the defensive side of the ball and special teams as well. And especially now in this day and age where we're constantly moving people around on defenses, and there's so many different packages and so many different schemes. And, as usual, offense is what's favored in the National Football League. The defense is always putting itself on, it's always kind of on its back heels and so on. We just saw a Super Bowl with 74 points in it that included one sack. Okay, of course, it turned out to be a pretty crucial sack, but, discussion for another time. So, but my point is that when you see people like Lewis and Urlacher, especially in this era, and I'm not going to get into the whole who's the greatest middle linebacker, or who's the greatest safety discussion and so on, or who's the greatest wide receiver, because errors are errors and so on, and they're all great. But I will have to say that it probably is a little more difficult to play defense than it ever was in this league, because every time you turn around, for the most part, if there's a rule change, it's certainly not there to help the defense.
No, not at all. And speaking of the offense, let's touch on the one wide receiver who will be there tonight, and that's Randy Moss. Russell, I would argue that Randy Moss is probably, if not one of the most physically gifted players to ever play the wide receiver position. And yeah, there were plays that he took off. Yeah, it seemed like he basically quit on the Raiders at the end of his career. He dropped off incredibly. He was just gone. But when Randy Moss was at his best, whether it was in Minnesota or with the New England Patriots, there's very few receivers to ever not just put up the kind of numbers that he did, but demand the kind of attention from defenses that he did.
Randy seemed, and listen, I don't know Randy or anything like that, and I'm not saying he's not a self-motivated guy. From all indications from people who have played with him and coached with him and so on, he is a savant when it comes to understanding offensive football. I mean, he really is. But you always got the sense that something needed to motivate Randy. I'm probably saying this the wrong way, okay? He slipped in the draft in 1998 because of issues at Marshall and Florida State.
Right.
He comes in and sets the rookie record for touchdown receptions with 17. A year later, they get within the game of the Super Bowl. After the fiasco with the Raiders, and by the way, to be fair, didn't seem like there was a lot of people quitting on the Raiders about that time during those days and so on. He was dealt there and so on. I think he came to New England thinking, I have a chance to turn things around. Who knew what was going to happen? Brady throws 50 touchdown passes. He has 23 of them, which is still the record for TD receptions in the season overall. That's not to make any excuses whatsoever for him. I mean, there were things Randy did on the field, the faking, pulling the pants down thing and walking off the field when he was in the playoff game and all those things. There were a lot of histrionics that, we could get into and so on. But I think with him, I don't think it was the fact that he was disruptive as far as being a teammate. I think there was a little selfishness in him to a degree, and some of that I think was very confident in his own abilities. Randy to me was a guy who I don't know if he needed to be pushed, but he seemed like he performed a hell of a lot better when people were saying he was done.
Interesting. Russell, before I let you go, and I always appreciate your time on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline here on 97.3 ESPN, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about the Philadelphia Eagles heading into 2018. And the thing I've been telling people through this whole offseason is that it's hard, historically, for a team to not just we repeat in the Super Bowl, but get back to the Super Bowl. We've seen numerous teams. The teams got depleted due to free agency. Guys would leave because they wanted more money or they had more opportunities elsewhere. So many times, teams don't just not repeat, but they don't even make it back to the Super Bowl, even the postseason, because in football, it's so hard to be able to get to that level each and every year.
Well, we haven't seen a repeat champion since the 03-04 Patriots, the years they won Super Bowl 38 and 39. But interesting enough, Josh, I think people kind of forget this. The last two, we've seen Super Bowl champions get back to the Super Bowl 2 of the last 4 years. But Seattle lost to New England. and New England lost to Philadelphia.
Right.
So for a while there, getting back-to-back was tough. Now we've kind of seen it, but closing the deal has been the most difficult. I'll tell you what's even tougher than repeating the Super Bowl champion. What's tougher is losing the Super Bowl and then coming back the following year and winning it. Any clue the last time that happened?
I'm drawing a blank. I feel like as soon as you say it, I'm going to smack myself.
Well, you would probably draw a blank because I doubt you were born yet. That's how long ago it's been. Josh, I have to go back to the 1972 Miami Dolphins.
Wow.
The last time a team lost the Super Bowl, they lost Super Bowl VI.
Right, the undefeated Dolphins team.
Yes, that's it. That's the last time, and one of only 2 times in the history of the Super Bowl. Ironically enough, it happened the previous year. Dallas lost Super Bowl V, won Super Bowl VI. Miami lost Super Bowl VI, won Super Bowl VII. It hasn't happened since.
Talk about when it rains, it pours, right? I mean, history just happens in such a short amount of time.
That's kind of like a flash flood.
Yeah.
Okay? Get raining and pouring. I mean, we're talking 40-something years. So, think about what New England will try to attempt to do this year and get. And by the way, New England will attempt to go to a 3rd straight Super Bowl, which has only happened 2 times previously. The Dolphins 3 in a row, and then the Bills 4 in a row. So, a lot of historic ramifications. But to get back to the Eagles, be remiss on my part not to remind people, and I don't have to remind any people in your area. We just saw a team win the Super Bowl with a backup quarterback, a backup left tackle, and a backup middle linebacker.
Right.
Goodness knows what could have happened. But then again, maybe that was the way it had to be done.
You know how it is. Sometimes teams just, gather around no matter what happens, and they're able to overcome. I mean, you mentioned the Dolphins. It's not like all those Dolphins teams, not like Bob Greasy was starting all those games for that Dolphins team.
Well, no. I mean, in 72, he missed the vast majority of the season. It was a different kind of game. It was it was geared toward running and defense. Then the rules changed and so on. But yeah, it's a different world. But again, repeating in the era of free agency, where rosters do change a lot more than they did in the 60s and 70s and so on. People forget, not everyone, because that would be a blanket statement of 8 billion people. People forget free agency's only been in the NFL since 1993. That's not a remarkably long time.
Right. It's a very small window of the league's history, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Russell, I always appreciate the time here on 97.3 ESPN. You always bring great insights and introspection into the league history. I look forward to having you on the show throughout the season.
You got it, Josh. Have a great weekend.